Okay, so at the end of the last chapter, Harry gets off the train, crosses the lake, enters the castle. Throughout this chapter, he gets sorted with the rest of his students, eats food until he's ready to burst, gets led to the Gryffindor common room, heads straight for his dormitory, and heads to bed. So, when do the first-year students actually take a shower before checking in for the night? I don't know about you, but I don't think I'd be able to sleep if I felt all grungy, no matter how comfortable the beds were. Spoiler warning. This is an in-depth retrospective and story analysis of the entirety of the Harry Potter books, one chapter at a time. If this is your first video in the series, it is highly recommended that you begin watching this series from the beginning, which you can do by going to the playlist that I provide right here. Okay, now that everyone is all caught up, let's continue. So here's a fun fact for you. This is the first chapter in the entire series to pick up exactly where the last chapter left off. Even Chapter 5 still had Harry waking up after about 5 to 6 hours of sleep at the end of Chapter 4. This chapter begins literally a split second after Chapter 6 ends. It's not really all that important to the story, but it's something I feel is worth pointing out nonetheless. Anyway, this chapter can be divided into 4 distinct sections: the pre-sorting section, the sorting ceremony itself, the start-of-term feast, and post-feast trip to Gryffindor Tower. Professor McGonagall makes her first appearance in the story since the first chapter. She is described as having black hair, and I'm left scratching my head at that. It will later be established that she was born in the year 1935, meaning she should be in her mid-50s as of the events of this chapter. So shouldn't she have gray or even white hair by now? Anyway, she gives the first-year students a quick briefing over how the house system works. Now, when McGonagall is describing the houses, she makes it sound like each house is completely interchangeable, that the differences between the houses are mostly semantic. Of course, that implication is going to get torn to shreds later in this very chapter, let alone this book, so I don't know what Rowling was thinking by misleading the audience this way. McGonagall states that the students will spend free time in their house common rooms, although even that's misleading. While the school does have a strict nighttime curfew, which will be a convenient plot device on multiple occasions throughout the series, there's no rule against students wandering the majority of the school during the day. However, then McGonagall starts to describe the House Cup, and that's when things start going off the rails. Now, when you're telling a story, ideally every plot device in your story should simultaneously fulfill 2 purposes at once. It should serve a narrative purpose, and it should serve an in-universe purpose. For example, in the Star Trek franchise, the Prime Directive serves a narrative function because every time the Enterprise crew goes against the Prime Directive, it conveys to the audience how serious the situation is. But it also serves an in-universe function, because it makes sense that we should force foreign technology and social customs onto a civilization before they're ready to handle it. The Harry Potter franchise, however, is chock full of plot devices that really only serve one of those 2 functions. They either add to the series' world building but never do anything to advance the plot in any meaningful way, like the Every Flavor Beans in the last chapter, or Peeves the Poltergeist, a recurring but ultimately superfluous character, or they will exist to serve a narrative function but will make little, if any, sense from an in-universe standpoint. Plenty of people have already mentioned how Quidditch is an example of the latter type of plot device, a sport designed to allow Harry to win games single-handedly, despite it making no sense as an actual sport. Everyone talks about that little plot device, but the series is actually chock full of these types of plot devices that don't get nearly as much attention from the fandom as the Quidditch example does. I'll be discussing each of these plot devices as the series progresses, and the House Cup is the first of the long list of plot devices that primarily serve a narrative function despite the lack of in-universe logic. The primary function of the House Cup, from a narrative perspective, is to provide a means for the character's actions to have consequences without those consequences causing the main plot to become derailed. A lot of the drama in these books are going to come from Harry and his friends defying his teachers, mostly Snape and Umbridge, or breaking school rules, mostly breaking curfew. The teachers obviously can't just overlook Harry doing these things, so they need a means of punishing him. But considering how often the main characters do these things, if more tangible punishments were used, that would cause the story's pacing to slow to a crawl. For this reason, detentions need to be used sparingly in the story, despite how much more frequently they would be used in a real-life context. To compensate for this, the House Cup and its corresponding point system enables Rowling to simply pencil in a line of dialogue whereby a teacher just takes points from Gryffindor, the main characters can grimace about that for a little bit, and then the plot can continue otherwise uninterrupted. However, that lack of tangible consequences is also the reason why it makes no sense in universe. Quite frankly, the House Cup is a complete joke of a competition. Winning the House Cup at the end of term bestows no tangible benefit to the students who worked so hard all year to get it, so it honestly comes off as the equivalent of the prize, a term used to describe some reward of ambiguous or abstract nature, often used by religious cults to encourage conformity without actually handing out any real prizes. They want this prize not because it conveys any real benefit, but simply because somebody else has told them that it's a prize they want. For a more elaborate explanation, I'd recommend checking out the Film Theorist's video on the movie Cats, specifically timestamp 633 through 1129 is when he discusses how the prize works in cult psychology. Now sure, the Quidditch Cup likewise doesn't bestow any actual benefit to its winners, but at least that, much like the trophies in other sports in the real world, serve more as a symbol of that team's victory rather than the prize itself. For most sports teams, the spirit of competition is its own reward, so it makes sense that the prize for winning be nothing more than a shiny trophy. Whereas the House Cup is little more than a glorified teacher's pet competition. Which leads me to my next point. There are no apparent rules for how points are awarded or taken away. Teachers seem to have near limitless discretion to give or take huge chunks of points from houses on a whim. Sometimes Hermione gets 5 points for answering a question in class, sometimes she gets 10. Sometimes a student gets 5 points taken from his house for talking out of turn in class. Sometimes they get upwards of 50 points taken. I mentioned that the House Cup is a glorified teacher's pet competition, but Snape in particular really just highlights how on the nose that description is. One chapter from now, Snape will take points from Gryffindor for not helping Neville in his potions lesson. And in Prisoner of Azkaban, he'll take points from Gryffindor because Neville got help from a classmate. The closest thing I was able to find that even remotely resembles a limitation on the teacher's power to control the house points is one that I deduced by reading between the lines. It is never explicitly confirmed in any of the 7 books or in any official sources of Harry Potter canon. With the exception of Albus Dumbledore, who obviously would be exempt from this limitation since he's the headmaster, I have never seen a single teacher give or take more than 50 points per student per action. But again, it's never been explicitly confirmed if regular teachers are forbidden from doing that, or if Rowling herself just never thought to have a teacher other than Dumbledore give or take more than 50 at a time. But even if that were an official limitation on the teacher's powers, it can, and at multiple points in the story is, easily circumvented simply by having teachers either give or take points based on multiple students' actions when multiple students act together, or taking points in rapid succession for multiple related actions. However, as arbitrary as the House Cup is, the fact that the headmaster, as I just mentioned, is exempt from what few limitations exist on the teacher's abilities to control the house points, if it even is an official limitation, causes this already completely arbitrary competition to become even more arbitrary. Combine that autonomy with the fact that the headmaster is the last of the school staff to speak before the House Cup gets handed out, and this teacher's pet competition is relegated to a glorified headmaster's pet competition. On the last day of term, one man can completely nullify the entire preceding's year's worth of hard work by every single student by just awarding a buttload of points for the slightest thing, and then handing out the House Cup immediately thereafter, without any student having a chance to take back the lead. At that point, the entire House Cup, in its entirety, is rendered wholly redundant. Why even bother with the point system in the first place at that point? Why not just have the headmaster, at the end of term, handing out the House Cup to whichever house he damn well pleases? Just abandon all pretense, if the pretense is that thinly veiled. Hell, even Quidditch, as flawed as it is, still has an objective scoring system with clear criteria how points are scored and how a winner is determined. I definitely plan to rip Quidditch a new one later in this retrospective series, although to be fair, thousands of other internet pundits have already done that. But even it doesn't allow the referee to, for example, declare that a Gryffindor snitch catch is only worth 1 point, while a Slytherin quaffle goal is worth 500 trillion points. The fact that catching the snitch is the only way to end the game is indeed a huge flaw in the system, but at least it doesn't give one person the ability to simply declare his favorite team as the winner to the exclusion of all other factors. For all of these reasons and more, it should come as no surprise that the House Cup is phased out of the story pretty quickly. It serves as a major subplot in the first book, but after that, Chamber of Secrets and Prisoner of Azkaban each dedicate less than a sentence to the results of the House Cup. And after that, the House Cup results are phased out of the story entirely, so that it's literally just the points that get mentioned. After all, as I mentioned earlier, the points are the whole reason the system exists from a narrative standpoint, so it makes sense that Rowling would phase out the part of this system that didn't directly assist in that narrative function. So after being left unattended briefly, the first-year students ponder how exactly they will get sorted into their houses. They meet the ghosts of Hogwarts and are surprisingly unafraid of them. Sure, they're startled a bit, but only by the ghosts' voices, not the fact that they are ghosts. When they turn around and notice that the ghosts are in fact ghosts, they don't seem to be even the slightest bit afraid. It will later be explained on Pottermore that ghosts tend to prefer hanging around Hogwarts primarily because its inhabitants are so tolerant of the undead. But these first-year students shouldn't have been indoctrinated in that tolerance yet, so shouldn't at least a few of them be crapping their pants? Anyway, we then enter the second section of this chapter, the sorting ceremony itself. McGonagall places the sorting hat on a stool, and then the sorting hat breaks into song. It describes the 4 houses and what traits are embodied in each house, therefore completely shattering the illusion McGonagall had attempted to bestow onto the first-year students just a few minutes prior about the houses all being interchangeable. Fun fact, according to an interview with Rowling, one of her earlier ideas for the story had a very different method of sorting. Rather than the old hat of Godric Gryffindor, the Great Hall would instead be adorned with statues of the 4 founders of Hogwarts. At the start of term, these 4 statues would spring to life and separate the first years into their houses. If I had to guess, I would say that Rowling abandoned this idea because she would still need to decide on an actual process for sorting. Now, a lot of people consider the Sorting Hat and the housing system in its entirety to be yet another one of those plot devices I mentioned earlier that exclusively serves a narrative function but which makes no sense in universe. People rightfully criticize the housing system because it needlessly sequesters students from other houses and therefore keeps them from hearing conflicting viewpoints. This formally enforced echo chamber system is precisely what leads to the kind of bigotry that fuels so many wizarding conflicts, like the belief in the superiority of pure-blood wizards. All of these criticisms are 100% valid, and because of this, many consider the housing system to be one of those plot devices that is exclusively a narrative-only plot device that makes no sense in universe. However, I am actually going to spend some time defending the housing system from an in-universe standpoint. Sure, it seems really archaic by today's standards, but we should also keep in mind that the Sorting Hat used to belong to Godric Gryffindor. This means that the Sorting Hat has been around for nearly 1,000 years. Back then, I can totally imagine that it was the social custom of the day to segregate students at such an early age. Bear in mind that back then, formal education of any kind was a privilege reserved almost exclusively for the super rich. So the Hogwarts founders were already being incredibly progressive for their time simply by allowing anyone with magical talent to enlist regardless of their social status. Okay, you're probably thinking right now, that may justify why the housing system was part of Hogwarts at the beginning, but it shouldn't have continued into the 20th and 21st centuries. Why haven't they abolished it hundreds of years after it stopped making sense culturally? Well, and this is pure speculation on my part, maybe they can't. As we will learn throughout the series, Hogwarts is quite a unique place even by wizarding standards. It has quite a few enchantments surrounding how it operates, and it seems that even the headmaster cannot just disable most of these enchantments, even if he wants to, or at the very least can only disable them temporarily. Perhaps the Sorting Hat and the housing system is one such enchantment that modern-day Hogwarts staff simply cannot undo. Think I'm reaching? Well, some evidence for this theory can be seen at the end of the series. In the penultimate chapter of the Deathly Hallows, The Flaw in the Plan, we see Voldemort destroy the Sorting Hat. However, the very next chapter, as Harry is accompanying his son Albus to Platform 9 3/4, it's clear the Hogwarts still uses not only the housing system, but also the Sorting Hat. Even though the Sorting Hat was literally destroyed, Hogwarts still somehow finds a way to use it. If there was ever a point when Hogwarts would decide to abolish the housing system, the fact that the means through which the students are sorted into their houses no longer exists certainly seems like a compelling reason to do so. The only explanation I can think of as to why they continue to use the housing system and the Sorting Hat, even when that should be impossible, is that the enchantments around Hogwarts make it physically impossible for Hogwarts to not use the Sorting Hat and housing system. Now, all of that being said, I still believe the modern Hogwarts teachers could do a lot more to make the housing system more of a formality. One of the easiest ways they could do that is by actively encouraging students from different houses to interact with each other on a more regular basis. Inter-house interactions is not against Hogwarts rules, so that can't be part of the original enchantments. However, it is so uncommon that, in Order of the Phoenix, the DA has to resort to using a protean charm because the inter-house interactions are so rare that they are inherently suspicious in and of themselves. But there is no reason why it has to be so rare. While I can probably accept that the locations of the House Common rooms might be part of the aforementioned enchantments that force Hogwarts to use the housing system whether they like it or not, we clearly see that the Great Hall is not segregated by house. A good chunk of the aforementioned problems with the housing system and the echo chamber it creates could be greatly alleviated if the Hogwarts teachers not only allowed, but actively encouraged students to interact with students of other houses. So anyway, the sorting begins. We get some character bits from some of the characters. Draco shows some swag when he gets sorted, establishing his character as a pompous dickhead. Hermione is shown to be an eager beaver when she runs up and jams the hat onto her head. Neville runs off with the hat still on his head after being sorted, setting up his chronic forgetfulness, which will be a staple of his character for the first 2/3 of the series. Fun fact, according to Pottermore, Neville actually telepathically asked the sorting hat to be put in Hufflepuff, but the hat, perhaps sensing his potential for bravery locked away deep inside him if he could just get over his self-confidence issues, put him in Gryffindor. Although it is unclear if the hat simply ignored Neville's choice, or if it persuaded Neville to accept Gryffindor, kind of like how it will attempt, to no avail, to persuade Harry to accept Slytherin. While Harry was waiting to be called, he starts to wonder what would happen if the sorting hat didn't give him a house at all, that he just sat there for ages until McGonagall stated that he had better get back on the train. Considering that Harry does indeed get chosen, this honestly seems like a completely pointless throwaway paragraph designed solely to pad out the chapter. However, it's actually a subtle reference to a story that never makes it into the series proper. The story of the only squib ever to be admitted to Hogwarts. Now, as you can probably guess, squibs are not allowed to study at Hogwarts for obvious reasons. However, there was one squib who actually came pretty damn close to being allowed to attend. His family had forged a letter of acceptance for him, and apparently had modified the Hogwarts records to reflect that, since his name was indeed called to be sorted. However, because there was no magic inside his head, the sorting hat's magic wasn't triggered, for lack of a better term, and instead just sat there silent and unmoving like it was still sitting on the stool. Because the sorting hat doesn't normally speak out loud except to declare a house, it took a solid hour before the teachers finally realized that something was wrong. They finally realized he was a squib after all, and he was sent back on the Hogwarts Express, his enrollment revoked. Obviously, that has no bearing on the current story, which is why it only appears on Pottermore. But having read that story on Pottermore, I can't help but notice that Harry's fears in this paragraph were clearly intended by Rowling to be a reference to that chunk of world building. Eventually, Harry gets called to the sorting hat. Harry begs and begs the sorting hat not to put him in Slytherin. As I mentioned a moment ago, the hat initially tries to persuade Harry to accept Slytherin, but Harry is steadfast in his desire not to be there. So the hat puts him in Gryffindor instead. Now, in The Cursed Child, Albus will be undergoing a similar nervous breakdown about being in Slytherin. However, unlike his father, Albus actually gets put in Slytherin. I actually have a theory as to why that is. Albus spent his first train ride to Hogwarts being constantly told by his father that being put in Slytherin isn't the end of the world. When he gets on the train, he befriends Scorpius Malfoy, so when he finally gets to Hogwarts, he is probably thinking, well, maybe Slytherin isn't so bad after all. Whereas Harry was wishing with all his might to not be in Slytherin, Albus is just kinda hoping he doesn't get put there, which may not have been strong enough to change the sorting hat's mind. Alternatively, when Harry told Albus that the sorting hat takes your choice into account, Perhaps Albus misinterpreted that paternal advice to mean that his choice would be given top priority over all other factors, perhaps even being singularly dispositive of the sorting process. But as we just saw with Neville, that is clearly not the case. So Albus was led into a false sense of security and therefore wasn't wishing with all his might not to be in Slytherin since he didn't realize he needed to. Anyway, Harry gets put in Gryffindor, as does his new best friend, Ron Weasley. Gee, it sure would have been awkward if the guy he befriended on the train ended up being in a different house than Harry. I mean, who else would Harry have had as a best friend if it wasn't Ron? The rest of the first-year students also get sorted, but nothing really of consequence happens in those sortings. However, it is said that Dean Thomas is both a black boy, even though he'll be cast as white in the movies, and is taller than Ron. Bear in mind that Ron was said in the last chapter to be the tallest of his brothers, who are considerably older than him. So just how tall is Dean Thomas? He must be about 7 feet tall and he's only 11 years old. So the sorting ceremony comes to a close, and we now enter section 3 of this chapter, the feast. Harry realizes just how hungry he is, saying that the pumpkin pasties felt like ages ago. But if you really think about it, they really weren't ages ago. In the last chapter, the train's intercom said they would be arriving at Hogwarts in 5 minutes. He and Ron gathered up their uneaten treats and got ready to disembark. I can't imagine it was more than an hour since he got off the train, seeing as the only things that happened since then were a short boat ride, a very brief stint waiting outside the Great Hall, and then the sorting of less than 50 first-year students. If Harry was so full from all those treats that he had entire pockets full of uneaten ones, he's not going to feel very hungry at all just a mere hour later. Anyway, Percy Weasley says that Dumbledore is indeed mad. For the entire 7-book series, this plot device will amount to a grand total of fuck all. And so the feast begins. Nearly Headless Nick, the ghost of Gryffindor House, starts a conversation with the first-year Gryffindor students. Now this is the moment when the ghosts should have been introduced for the first time. Here, it makes sense that the first-year students wouldn't be afraid of the ghosts, since now they have the teachers and older students to lead by example and show that the ghosts are nothing to be afraid of. Anyway, he claims he hasn't eaten in nearly 400 years, implying that's how long he's been dead. But next book, it will be revealed that the upcoming Halloween will be his 500th death day, meaning that he's been dead a whole century longer than he claims to be in this book. It is my understanding that this will be corrected in later editions of the book, where he will claim that he hasn't eaten in nearly 500 years. But my PDF copy of this book, as well as the copy of the audiobook read by Jim Dale, still has the 400-year line in it. While we're on the topic of ghosts, I would like to know what exactly are the duties and responsibilities of a house ghost. Presumably there's an actual formal process to declaring someone to be a house ghost, because otherwise any ghost could just come to Hogwarts and declare themselves a house ghost. But if there's some formal process to selecting a house ghost, that would imply that there are some responsibilities attached to the position. Despite this, in literally all 7 books, the only time we ever see a house ghost actually do anything school-related is in the next chapter, when Nearly Headless Nick is assisting first-year Gryffindor students in navigating the elaborate labyrinth that is the Hogwarts castle. But even then, the implication there is that it's something Nick is choosing to do, not something that is expected of him as a house ghost. As the feast continues, we get Neville's backstory. It turns out that Rowling hadn't yet decided on the term squib to refer to a muggle-born to wizard parents, since Neville states that his family thought he was all muggle for ages, even though the term squib would be the appropriate term in that context. Then Harry glances over to the teacher's table, locks eyes with Professor Snape, and, for the first time in the series, his scar hurts him. Now, this recurring scar pain will become a major plot device as the series progresses, but in this instance, it's a big mystery why it happens. Narratively speaking, the fact that it happens as soon as Snape makes eye contact with Harry is used to set up Snape as a red herring villain for this book. In the future, it will be further elaborated upon that Harry's scar hurts him whenever Voldemort is either close by or is having mood swings on par with My Last Girlfriend on the third week of each month. This is another one of those plot devices that serves a narrative purpose but which makes little if any sense in universe. After all, why does Harry's scar hurt him in these extremely plot-specific ways? At the end of the series, we eventually learn that Harry is an unintentional Horcrux of Voldemort's, so we can probably assume that this is one of those side effects of Horcrux magic, and since it was an accidental Horcrux, it obviously behaves in different ways than intentional Horcruxes do. However, that still does not give Rowling an excuse to simply make up the rules as she goes along. We still need a clear set of rules as to what each plot device can and can't do, and their ability to break the Muggle laws of physics cannot make it all powerful. The excuse of "because magic" is not a defense to poor storytelling. To try and alleviate this problem, Rowling eventually stated in a podcast titled Pottercast 130 that Harry's scar hurt him because the Horcrux inside his body was sensing that its true master was nearby and is attempting to escape Harry's body through his scar and rejoin its true master. However, even that is a very sloppy explanation, as there are still two major problems that this explanation fails to patch up. First, it would at best provide an in-universe explanation for why Harry's scar would hurt whenever Voldemort was close by, but it does not explain why his scar hurts whenever Voldemort is having his PMS mood swings. Second, that still begs the question, why doesn't Harry's scar hurt him on a weekly basis whenever he's attending a Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson in the first book? See what I mean when I say that Harry's scar is a plot device that exists solely for its narrative convenience and nothing more? So, with the feast wrapping up, we now enter the fourth and final section of this chapter, the post-feast and a trip to Gryffindor Tower. Dumbledore gives his start-of-term speech. He sets forth a rule that says that no magic is to be used in the corridors in between classes. This rule will never come into play during this book. It will make a single cameo appearance in the next book before being dropped entirely. He also states that the third floor corridor on the right-hand side, whatever that means, I mean, it would make more sense to say north, south, east, or west side, because right-hand side would change depending on what direction a person is facing, is out of bounds, not just to students, but to everybody. He says that anyone who goes in there would suffer a very painful death, setting up the A-plot for this book. Then we have the school song. It is said that the other teachers' smiles were rather fixed. I think Rowling knew, even this early in the series, that she wasn't planning on having this school song be a recurring element of the start-of-term formula. After all, even in this book, its only narrative purpose is to showcase Fred and George's characters by showing us how they don't like being in unison with everyone else, how they prefer to operate at the beat of their own drum. However, there's really only one way a school song can showcase that kind of character, so any other time Rowling did the song, it would have to be an almost identical repeat of this version of the song, and that would just be repetitive. So, knowing how repetitive it would likely get, she penciled in a line about the other teachers' smiles being fixed, so she would have an in-universe excuse for discontinuing the song in future books. That being the other teachers finally working up the courage to tell Dumbledore that nobody liked the song except for him. As we begin the journey to Gryffindor Tower, we get introduced to Peeves the Poltergeist, a recurring but ultimately superfluous character. A lot of people criticize the movies for not having the character make even so much as a cameo appearance in literally all 8 movies. Well, why would they? He's featured prominently in every book, but he never really does anything of consequence in the story. On 2 occasions in all 7 books, Peeves comes sorta close to providing a major plot contribution. 2 chapters from now, when his attempts to tattle on Harry and company force them to retreat into the Forbidden Corridor, and much later down the line in Order of the Phoenix, when he makes it his mission in life to make Umbridge's job as difficult as possible. However, as I will explain when I get to those 2 moments in the story, his presence in those 2 moments is ultimately insufficient to justify his inclusion in the movies, which inevitably had to be cut some content to fit into a strict time limit anyway. Narratively speaking, his primary role in the story is to serve as an antithesis and arch-nemesis to Argus Filch, and that's quite literally the beginning and end of his significance to the story. So Harry is led to Gryffindor Tower, decides to go to bed, sans shower as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and then we get to the biggest narrative faux pas of the entire series up to this point. Harry's dream on his first night in Hogwarts. He dreams that he's wearing Quirrell's turban. This turban is talking to him, telling him to transfer to Slytherin. Draco Malfoy and Snape are both laughing at him. The turban then causes a flash of green light and Harry wakes up, but then he just goes back to sleep and doesn't remember the dream. That last part, the part about him not remembering the dream, is what makes this dream such a big fuck up on Rowling's part. See, because most of us watching this retrospective series already know the full story, we can very easily see that this is foreshadowing the fact that Voldemort is hidden underneath that turban. That's easy for us to figure out, but let's think about this from the perspective of someone reading this story for the first time. Those people do not know what the climax of this book will entail. This dream effectively spoils the climax of this book for those people. See, the dream ends with a bright flash of green light. We already know from the 2nd chapter that Harry associates this green light with the death of his parents, although he doesn't yet know exactly why. So in this dream, Quirrell's turban is obviously meant to be associated with the death of Harry's parents. Now combine that with the fact that, in the 4th chapter, Harry learns that his parents' death was caused by a villain named Voldemort. Voldemort is now overtly linked to the death of Harry's parents also, meaning that Voldemort and the Green Light are now inextricably linked together in Harry's subconscious. So when you take all of that into account, that basically means that this dream is now telling the readers that Quirrell's turban, and by proxy Quirrell himself, is associated with Voldemort. In other words, this dream is effectively spoiling for first-time readers that Quirrell is the main villain of this book. For most of this book, Snape will be a red herring villain, but unless the readers are being completely obtuse, they should already know that Quirrell is the real villain. It's kinda hard to be a red herring villain when the real villain has already been revealed. This could have been alleviated somewhat by removing the line about Harry not remembering the dream when he woke up the next morning. If that were the case, first-time readers could reasonably have expected that this wasn't foreshadowing, but rather set up to advance the plot later down the line. Kind of like how the chocolate frogs in the last chapter were set up in order to advance the plot later in this same book, or how Harry's recurring dream in Order of the Phoenix, where he's in the Department of Mysteries, will eventually get a payoff. But because Harry didn't remember the dream, that means it could never come into play later in the story, So foreshadowing is the only narrative purpose it possibly could serve. Once a first-time reader realizes that it is necessarily foreshadowing, they're going to be wondering what it could possibly be foreshadowing about, leading them to make the aforementioned connections between the green light and Voldemort. If they were still entertaining the possibility of it being a plot device, first-time readers might not have been quite as ready to put the pieces together. There is very little plot advancement in this chapter. The story is still in the process of acclimating us, the audience, to this new world. As such, there is foreshadowing aplenty, but very little in the way of plot advancement. The closest we get to plot advancement is Dumbledore telling us that the third floor right-hand side corridor is off limits under pain of death. Everything else is either foreshadowing or establishing of the status quo, e.g. Harry being in Gryffindor and how the House Cup actually works. Character-wise, Harry is once again relegated to a reactive rather than proactive role. Since the plot is still acclimating the audience to this new world, Harry is still serving as the audience surrogate who absorbs all this exposition on our behalf. As such, there really isn't much opportunity for Harry to be an active protagonist. The closest we get to him being proactive is begging the Sorting Hat not to put him in Slytherin. Most of the other characters get only a single sentence each of character development. As I mentioned earlier, Hermione is shown to be an eager beaver, Draco is a pompous asshole, and Neville is forgetful and bumbling. The way he handles being sorted, as well as his backstory during the feast, establish that he will be the go-to underdog for most of the story. Dumbledore gets the most character development this chapter, but it's development that is contrary to how he will be portrayed for the rest of the series. He opens up the feast with complete gibberish, leading Harry to ponder and Percy to even confirm that he is in fact partially mad. However, just like his leg scar in the first chapter, this madness never gets any payoff or is even mentioned again for the rest of the series. Now sure, the Super Carlin brothers came up with a theory about how this line was supposed to be a reference to the Four Houses, but I honestly don't buy it. If Dumbledore wanted to promote unity between the Four Houses, he had much more overt ways of doing it, not the least of which being, as I mentioned earlier in this video, actively encouraging students from different houses to interact with each other on a regular basis. After the feast, Dumbledore is shown to be extremely careful and deliberate with the information he chooses to reveal to people. He tells everyone to stay out of the Forbidden Corridor, but he never gives us a reason why. Unlike his madness, this is one character trait we will see pop up from time to time as the series progresses, being extremely selective about the details he chooses to reveal. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I hope you enjoyed this retrospective of this chapter. Next chapter, Harry actually begins his classes and meets Professor Snape, and you can bet I'll have some stuff to say about that. Until next time, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.